Comic books have become huge business. You know, in years past, it used to be the market for comic books seemed to be elementary school-aged boys, right, with their allowance. But now they make blockbuster movies that make billions of dollars worldwide. People just can't seem to get enough of that opportunity to escape into a fantasy world where people have superpowers. Well, our study of Judges brings us now to a series of stories that read like something from a comic book. Judges 14, 15, and 16 chronicle the exploits of Samson, who served as a judge in Israel sometime around 1100 BC. Now, of course, I'm sure you're aware Samson is known for his supernatural strength. But there's more to his story than just that. You might even, like I say, you might be tempted to place it in the realm of fiction, of, like a comic book. But everything we've seen thus far in the book of Judges has been, we've seen these realistic accounts of historical events. So there's really no reason to think that the author would depart from that standard now as he comes to this story of Samson. In fact, Samson's, really, when you get down to it, he's not portrayed as a hero. And if that's your view of him, if you insist on viewing him that way, I think you're going to miss the lessons that God wants us to learn from his life. He's presented as someone who is uniquely gifted by God, but who also squandered those gifts and fell far short of the calling that God had given him. James chapter 1, verse 17 in the New Testament says this: "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." Now, I think this kind of helps us connect this story with our lives. Because though we may not have supernatural strength like Samson, there are countless gifts that God has given us. And so we have to ask ourselves as we read his story, are we using the gifts that God's given us in a way that honors him, in the way that he intended, for the purpose that he desires and wants to accomplish in our lives? Now, today we're going to look, as I say, at Judges 14 and 15, and this story of Samson's exploits. I think it shows us 6 gifts that should be used for God's purpose and glory. And interestingly, strength isn't one of those that we're going to be talking about today. These are all the other things that are wrapped in the passage that I think we tend to overlook. And so the first gift that comes out in this section of Judges is the gift of marriage. You know how in chemistry, it's been a long time since I've taken a chemistry class, but when you mix 2 chemicals together, you may end up with something that's weak, that's unstable, that may be even explosive. But on the other hand, the right mixture can produce something that's stronger, something that's more useful, that's more powerful. And I think marriage can go either way. Right? It's sort of like that. God designed marriage as a gift to bring about spiritual growth and maturity in both husband and wife. But when people ignore God's design for marriage, we all know that the result can be disastrous. Well, Judges 14, verses 1 through 3 records Samson's foolish approach to marriage. Take a look. It says, "Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, 'I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife.' But his father and mother said to him, 'Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?' But Samson said to his father, 'Get her for me, for she's right in my eyes.'" That last phrase is key. Later in the book, the author of Judges is going to use that to describe the underlying problem in Israel, that they're doing what's right in their own eyes, not what's right in God's eyes, right? In this case, Samson seems to be just selecting a wife based on appearance. In fact, it sounds like he just saw her once, like he happened to be walking through town, and he saw her, and then he goes back to his dad and says, "Dad, she's the one. She'll be a good wife for me." Right? He doesn't seem to know her personally. He doesn't seem to know her character or anything about her. Now, in that culture, arranged marriages were normal. That was common, but typically the way that worked is that those marriages were arranged between two families that knew each other, that had history, right? They understood and trusted each other. The only thing Samson seems to know about her here is that she happens to be a Philistine. Yet the problem with that is that God's law prohibited the Israelites from marrying people from the other nations. Deuteronomy 7, verses 3 through 4 explains God's rationale for that. Take a look. He said, "You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons." Why? Look at the next verse, verse 4. "For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly." See, God wanted the people of Israel to choose a spouse to marry someone who would strengthen their faith, not someone who would undermine it. Samson seems to just ignore that clear warning. But take a look at what the author says in Judges 14, verse 4. He says, "His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel." Well, what do we do with that? How do we interpret this? I mean, in what sense was this marriage from the Lord? I think it's important to say God was not leading Samson to disobey his law. Right? God doesn't do that. But what I think the author is getting at is that the Lord was determined to use Samson's sinful choice to accomplish his own larger purpose of saving Israel from Philistine oppression. That wasn't Samson's intention here, but is what the Lord was doing in spite of Samson's choice. I mean, this marriage was going to explode, right? This was a bad chemistry experiment in the making. But God was still going to work through the mess. That's what God does. That's who he is. Now, I think that's an important lesson for us, an important insight about God, because if you're single right now, then I think this story stands as this great warning, right? Don't be impetuous. Don't be haphazard about choosing a spouse, right? Because don't marry someone just because they're right in your eyes. Look for the person who's right in God's eyes. Wait until you find the person who trusts in Christ and demonstrates the fruit of the Spirit. It's an encouragement. If you're already married, if maybe you didn't follow that course, if you ignored God's design, then I think there's some encouragement for you here too. Because it says that God is still at work, right? That you can trust him. Unwise choices we've made in our past, they don't derail God's plans. He still accomplishes his good and perfect will. So whatever your situation is, whatever your circumstances, make sure that you approach the gift of marriage in a way that honors God, that respects his purpose. The gift of marriage. The second gift that comes out in this passage is the gift of commandments. Fences, sometimes they're ornate and decorative. Most of the time they're not, right? A fence serves a purpose. It's functional. It's practical. It marks a boundary. It keeps the people you don't want out, right? It keeps the people you want to protect in. And that becomes really important, say, for instance, if you live on a busy road. I mean, a fence might be the thing that protects your pet or even your child from wandering out into traffic. It keeps them safe. Well, God's commandments function the same way. Right? They draw a line. They establish a boundary. But God, even though they may not make sense to us sometimes, God does that as our Heavenly Father to protect us. Right? He marks those boundaries to keep us safe. He's our Heavenly Father. He's wise. He cares for us. That's why He gives us these commandments. We have to trust that. Well, in Judges 13, last week, we learned that God wanted Samson to be devoted to Him, even from the womb. Right? We read about the story. The angel of the Lord instructed Samson's mother to follow all the stipulations that were part of the Nazirite vow, described in Numbers chapter 6. So that meant he wasn't supposed to drink wine or even eat anything that was made from grapes. He wasn't supposed to eat anything that was unclean under the Old Testament law. If you've ever tried reading through like Leviticus, you've probably gotten stuck in those lists of all the things they could and couldn't eat, right? Well, he had to be careful about that, particularly. And then the angel didn't mention it in Judges 13, but back in number 6, when that whole idea of the Nazirite vow is first laid out, it also says that someone who takes that vow isn't supposed to come into contact with a dead body. So the whole idea of these rules was, again, they're like these fences. Samson's life was supposed to be set apart. He was supposed to be different from the culture. He was supposed to live a holy life as an example for the people of Israel, to lead them into breaking away from going along with all the idolatry of the Philistines. Well, this next passage in Judges 14, verses 5 through 9, it reveals to us that Samson wasn't conscientiously following those rules. Take a look. It says, "Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. After some days he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion, and honey. He scraped it out into his hands and went on, eating as he went. And he came to his father and mother and gave some to them, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion." Now, interesting story, right? This whole idea of the lion and everything. And again, it's easy to get caught up in the physical feat of that, of this man defeating a lion. But if you step back for a moment and look at this, Samson sort of, I picture him as a child pressing his face up against the fence, kind of reaching out, testing the boundaries here. He's toying with danger. Think about it. From the very start of the passage, they come to a vineyard. Rather than avoiding it and going around it, he passes through. Now, he doesn't eat anything. At least he doesn't tell us that he ate anything. But he was within arm's reach, right? When the lion attacks, he doesn't just try to scare it off, right? He tears it apart. And that may have violated the spirit of the Nazirite vow. Now, some people say that the vow specifically applied to not coming into contact with a dead human body, with a human corpse. But, it seems to highlight the point that he didn't tell his parents about it. Maybe he felt some sense of guilt. That's going to become important later on in the story here. But then we come to the whole thing of eating the honey. And that was clearly a violation of his vow, of this Nazirite vow. The honey would have been considered unclean because it came from the carcass of a dead animal. So here, again, Samson must have felt some kind of guilt. He doesn't tell his parents about what happens, but he does share the honey with them. So the whole thing is questionable. It calls into question Samson's commitment, his devotion, right? He's toying with these rules. So the question is that the way that we approach God's commandments? Do we think of them as barriers that hinder our freedom? Are we always trying to press as far as we can without going across the line? David articulated a completely different view of God's commandments. I think this is the view that we should have. Psalm 19, I'm going to read verse 7 all the way down through verse 14. It says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey, and the drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is your servant warned. In keeping them there is great reward. Who can discern his errors? Declare me innocent from hidden faults. Keep back your servant from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression." And then this verse 14, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." Somehow I just don't see that attitude at work in Samson in this whole story, right? It doesn't seem like that's where his mind and heart are. What about you? How are you relating to this gift that God gives us in His Word, His truth, His commands? Do you kind of resent them? Or do you receive them as wisdom and guidance, as a treasure? The next gift that comes out in the story of Samson is the gift of wisdom. I mean, in a way, you could look at life as a series of puzzles, right? Even as we grow and develop, we progress from one level to another. When infants, they're sorting out just how to control their limbs, right? How to crawl, how to walk, learning to speak, and then learning to read. And we move on to relationships. Those are certainly puzzling. And that whole ability to learn and to grow, that's a gift from God. Proverbs chapter 2, verses 6 through 8 says, "For the Lord gives wisdom. From His mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He's a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of His saints." Right? The Lord is the one, if you have wisdom and understanding in any capacity, it's from God. Right? It's a gift from Him. But again, it's the question, how are we using that? Are we using it for the Lord, or are we squandering it on our own selfish goals? Now, Samson, again, we know him for his strength, but as we look at Judges 14, verses 10 through 14, it demonstrates that he also had an intellectual side. Take a look. Verse 10, it says, "His father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there. For so the young men used to do." This is his wedding feast. "As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. And Samson said to them, 'Let me now put a riddle to you.'" So it's kind of like a bachelor party, right? He says, "Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes." And they said to him, "Put your riddle that we may hear it." And he said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." It says in 3 days they could not solve the riddle. Now, riddles like this, those were kind of the intellectual tests of the ancient world. And Samson crafted a very difficult riddle here. Hard for them to solve. Now, later on in the chapter, we learn that Samson judged Israel for 20 years. So he could certainly use this gift of wisdom in a constructive way, but that's not what's going on here. Here, he's using it for a very selfish purpose. He's really kind of taking advantage of these men. Right? He's wanting to get a bunch of clothes. Right? Clothes were valuable in the ancient world. But it wasn't wise enough because he didn't take into account the character of the men that he was with. Right? He didn't realize how ruthless they were. Take a look at verse 15 down through 18. It says, on the fourth day, they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? And Samson's wife wept over him and said, you only hate me. You do not love me. You've put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is. And he said to her, behold, I have not told my father nor my mother, and shall I tell you? She wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted, and on the seventh day he told her, because she pressed him hard. And then she told the riddle to her people, and the men of the city said to him on the seventh day, before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. I don't know how many women would like being called a heifer, but another issue about wisdom there. Separate discussion. So here's Samson, and he's caught, right? His wisdom's all falling apart. And so what does he do? He turns to his strength. He relies on his strength to solve his problem. Look at verses 19 and 20. It says, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. So, again, like I said, this whole thing's exploding, right? It's a mess. And here, God gives Samson this great strength to overthrow the Philistines. But that's not what's happening here, is it? I mean, he doesn't lead this military campaign or something incredible like that. He goes and kills 30 guys to take their clothes. His anger here, his angry response, pays off his debt, but it doesn't benefit the people of Israel. If anything, his response here calls into question his wisdom, right? I mean, it just makes Samson look like a hothead. In Proverbs 14, verse 29, there we read, whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. That's the outcome here with Samson, unfortunately. The Lord had given him wisdom, but he just acts, he uses it in a selfish way and then acts out of anger. What about the wisdom and understanding that God's given you? Think about that. With your perspective on life, the experiences you've had, the insights that he's given you, are you using those in a way that honors God, that serves his purpose? It's the gift of wisdom. Closely related, the next gift is the gift of skill. Our hands are remarkably complex. Right? They have 27 bones, 29 joints, at least 123 named ligaments. And so we are able to use our hands with great precision. We don't even think about it, to feel things, to grasp objects. One man called the hand the cutting edge of the mind. Interesting idea, right? Because we use our hands to shape and to build things. We use our hands you can use it to grow food or to hunt. You can use it to write, to draw, to even play musical instruments. And all of those physical skills, those abilities, they're gifts from God. Right? Evidence that we've been made in the image and likeness of our Creator. Gifts that we should use for Him. But, again, skillful hands can also be used for destructive purposes. As we see in this next passage in Judges chapter 15, take a look at verses 1 through 8. The story continues. It says, after some days, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. So just kind of like all of this other background didn't happen. And he said, I will go into my wife in the chamber. But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches, and he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Then the Philistines said, who's done this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. And Samson said to them, if this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I will quit. And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow. And he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Etam. So here we have another incredible feat, right? Catching all of these foxes. That couldn't be an easy task. I don't know how you tie a torch between the tails of two foxes. I mean, so Samson, you couldn't do that. This isn't just a matter of brute strength, right? I mean, he has some skill. He knows how to trap animals. And yet, how does he use this? He burns down the crops, right? He burns down the olive orchards. Now, destructive tactics like that was common in ancient warfare. But God told the Israelites to not fight that way. Back in Deuteronomy, when they were entering the land, he wanted the people to preserve the natural resources of the land because God was going to give it to them. He didn't want them to have this destroyed wasteland. So here Samson is. He's using this skill, this gift of skill that God's given him, and he uses it basically just in personal vengeance. Right? Not only destroying the crops, but then striking them down, and whatever it means when it says that he struck them hip and thigh. He's a formidable fighter. But it calls, again, we step back and it calls into question, what about the skills that God's given you? How do you use those? Are you using them in a constructive, in a beneficial way, in a way that honors God? When we look to the New Testament, Colossians 3, verses 23 through 24 tells us, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for man, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. All right, we should use our skills for the Lord, for Him, for His glory, for His purpose. The next gift that we see in this series of stories, I think it's the gift of leadership. Life's full of choices, right? You can take the easy way. It's minimal risk, minimal effort, or you can choose the hard way, the uphill climb. And at some of those crossroads, God also gives us the opportunity to influence others. We can encourage people to choose the challenging path, right? The path of faith and obedience to God. Or we can just allow them to keep drifting on in whatever direction they're heading. Those opportunities to exercise leadership are a gift from God. Now, our next passage, Judges 15, verses 10 through 13, it tells the story of a pivotal moment like that, a crossroad where Samson, I think, had the opportunity to lead the people of Israel. Let's see how he handles that. It says, verse 10 in chapter 15, then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah, and they made a raid on Lehi. And the men of Judah said, why have you come up against us? They said, we've come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you've done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so have I done to them. And they said to him, we've come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves. They said to him, no, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will surely not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Now, we don't know how big this army of Philistines was that came that day. But there were an awful lot of men here in this group from the tribe of Judah, right? 3,000 men. Think back in the book of Judges. Barak, when he had conquered the Canaanites, he had 10,000 men. But then there's Gideon, right? Gideon only had 300 men. And the Lord gave him victory over the Midianites back in Judges 7. So 3,000 men, that was a considerable force. They were scared of the Philistines. Samson had the opportunity there. He could have mentioned the Lord. He could have talked about how God strengthened him. He could have said some encouraging word for them to trust in God. And he didn't. All that he says is, don't kill me yourself. Right? It's very self-focused. I think he could have led them to victory here. But he doesn't do it. Samson chose, again, to just fight alone. Take a look at verses 14 through 16. It says, when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. And then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that had caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men. Now, this was an incredible feat, right? That's undeniable. But I think the point is that it could have been so much more. Right? If Israel had rallied behind Samson, God could have given them victory over the Philistines then and there. They could have celebrated the sovereign power of God, but instead, Samson composes this little poem boasting in his own accomplishment. Right? The Spirit of the Lord gave him strength. But he doesn't mention that here. That's not what he's celebrating. Now, for us, we may never lead an army into battle, but God still gives us opportunities to exercise influence in the lives of people. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 14, Paul talks about the kind of influence we should exercise in the lives of one another in the church. He says, we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all. Are you willing to speak up in some of those pivotal moments to encourage people that are scared, to serve the Lord, to be bold, to step forth in faith? See, those opportunities are a gift from God. We're responsible to use them for Him, for His glory. One more gift that I think we see in this series of stories from Samson, it's the gift of prayer. Think for a moment, if you had a hotline with direct access to the President of the United States, wouldn't that be interesting right now? What issues would you discuss with the President? Maybe healthcare, national economy, some of the conflicts taking place around the world. You probably wouldn't tell the President about the pothole that's down the street from your house that needs to be filled, right? That would be beneath the office of president. Well, in a way, when you think about it, with prayer, we have something far greater than a hotline to the president, right? We have access to the God of all creation, the God of the universe. And so that's a precious gift, having that access to the Lord. You have to ask, how are we using it? Now, as we think about these stories with Samson, We don't have any indication whether he prayed about the whole marriage thing, or whether he prayed as he was going into this conflict with the Philistines. It just doesn't mention it. Maybe he did, but it seems like he was just trusting in his own strength and wisdom. So we don't read of him praying until we get to verse 17 here in Judges 15. 17 through 20. Take a look. There the author writes, "As soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramoth-Lehi. And he was very thirsty. And he called upon the Lord and said, 'You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?' And it says, God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned and he revived. Therefore the name of it was called En Hakkore. It is at Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years." So Samson prays, and there's no word of praise or thanksgiving. There's no acknowledgement of the character of God. He doesn't even make a humble request, right? He acknowledges that God gave him the victory, but he does so to kind of lead into this, honestly, kind of obnoxious rhetorical question. You know, God, you gave me victory. You going to let me die now? I mean, a humble person wouldn't even speak to a slave that way, right? And here's Samson taking this tone, this rude, demanding tone with the Lord. And the Lord responds with remarkable grace. He answers. He provides for Samson's need in a miraculous way. How gracious is that? Now, admittedly, Samson's circumstances were desperate, but the way he speaks to the Lord couldn't be more different than what we see in the Psalms or in the Lord's Prayer. Right? Matthew 6, verses 9 through 13 tells us that Jesus said, "Pray then like this, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Now, of course, you know, and it's clear in that passage that Jesus wasn't giving this prayer as something to be repeated verbatim. The prayer stands as a guideline, a model, right? Like an outline. He wants us to pray in light of his kingdom purposes. And we still lift up our physical needs, but we should do so in a humble way. And we see that here. You know, and so we come back to this. How are you using the gift of prayer? Do you approach God in a demanding, disrespectful way? Or do you come before him humbly, right? Realizing the incredible privilege of drawing near to the Lord? And when you pray, is it just about the immediate physical need, or does it go beyond that? Are you praying for the kinds of things that Jesus talked about here, for God to be glorified, for his kingdom to come? We need to use the gift of prayer in a way that honors God. So next time, we're going to look at Judges 16 to see the last part of Samson's story. For now, however, we can reflect on these 6 gifts that God's given us: marriage, commandments, wisdom, skill, leadership, and prayer. Maybe you've never thought about some of those things from that angle, from that perspective, as something that God's given as a resource to use, as a blessing from him. If that's the case, maybe you just need to come to that place where you begin to see God as the giver of all that is good. Every good thing comes from him. He's actively involved in your life, in the details of it. Do you acknowledge him that way? Do you respond to him with thanksgiving and gratitude and praise? Do you want to learn more about who the Lord is, about how he works through all the circumstances of our life? I think a good parallel passage to read is James chapter 1. And even that key verse we read at the beginning this morning from James 1:17, that's a great one to commit to memory. Or maybe today, as we've thought through these different gifts, maybe there's one of those that stands out to you. One of those where you need to change how you think about that, where you need to use it in a way that really honors the Lord, that serves his purpose. So we ended the passage there at the end of chapter 15. We saw how gracious the Lord was towards Samson. And he extends that same grace and mercy toward us. We stumble through life, and sometimes we make a mess of things. But the Lord's good. And the Lord is at work even in the midst of all of that. I mean, that's the overarching lesson here from Samson. God's good. May God be lifted up